Good evening. I welcome our important guests from Germany, and with the permission of the President, the Rector, and the Rabbi Rappaport, I will tell you about the Demjanjuk trial. The man himself, Ivan Demjanjuk, the name John was something he sort of added to his name when he was in the U.S. He was not born John, he was born Ivan Demjanjuk from the Ukraine. He was just a tiny screw in the system, but an extremely murderous one in that destruction machine of the Nazis, the way I'm going to explain. But like him, there were many thousands, if not even more, whose names are left unknown to us. And they all died. And this John Demjanjuk, when he himself was just a young Ukrainian man who fought in the ranks of the Red Army at the beginning of the Second World War. He was injured in the war. He returned to the war and was taken captive by the Germans in Kerch, in the Crimea, and from there it wasn't that clear what happened to him. Ultimately, he was sentenced, as the moderator said, to death by the special court, district court in Jerusalem, headed by the Chief Justice Dov Levin and two district court judges, Justice Dalia Dorner and yours truly. The appeal was heard only 2 or 3 years later for different reasons that I will explain later. And in the meantime, archives were opened in the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain became cracked, and with the help of different documents that came from the Soviet Union, the Supreme Court, presiding over the appeal, found a reasonable doubt to the question whether the defendant is truly Ivan the Terrible, as he was called by the Jews, if he indeed is the one to whom all those terrible deeds are attributed to. And this is why he was acquitted by the Supreme Court, and at the end of the day he was actually extradited to Germany. He was brought to trial in a German court and was sentenced for 5 years of imprisonment for participating in the murder of 28,000 Jews in Sobibor extermination camp. But he never served those 5 years of imprisonment because he spent 2 years in a detention facility during the trial, and because of his old age, they allowed him not to sit in prison, and there in Germany he passed away in 2011. Very, very briefly and in a nutshell, we can say that this is some sort of a passing wave, a passing ripple in the ocean of torture and torment of the Holocaust. But this tiny screw actually opened an aperture through which we can see and understand what happened in the extermination camps, without which the extermination camps would have gone unnoticed in the shadow of Auschwitz, as if they never existed. And hence the importance of the trial, because it gave us a testimony that was examined in court and was put to the test of the Supreme Court, as I will explain. And confronted the very prevalent tendency of Holocaust denial, and the power of a testimony that was given in court with the good, defense attorneys has in its power the ability to withstand such denials. I will start with the decision of the heads of the Nazi regime in Germany from the Wannsee conference. Wannsee was a suburb, a very beautiful suburb of Berlin. On the 20th of January 1942, there convened in Wannsee a conference of the heads of the Nazi regime, among them Adolf Eichmann, in order to decide about the final solution of the Jewish problem. In other words, the elimination of the Jewish people. It's the month of Adar now, very close to the holiday of Purim, and we do remember the wish of Haman to destroy and eliminate and exterminate all the Jews, women, children, babies, and old people, all in one day. And in the Wannsee conference, they decided to destroy, to murder, and to eliminate all the Jews, men, women, children, babies, not in one day, but yes, in 1 year. In that Wannsee conference, the participants calculated the number of Jews that exist in Europe in every country. They didn't skip over Albania that enumerated 200 Jews. In another source, not the trial, I heard that in the island of Malta there was one Jew, and they didn't skip over him too. They sent a special ship to hunt him down as well. Following the Wannsee resolution, Reinhard Heydrich was given the task of organizing the extermination of, first of all, the Polish Jews in the General Gouvernement. You have to remember that at the beginning of 1942, the German army already took over almost the entire continent of Europe, definitely Poland and Lithuania, the Ukraine, and it advanced beyond Moscow. And at the very peak of its power, Heydrich decided that after a short while, and as you know, after a short while he was murdered near the Czechoslovakia, near Prague. So the entire operation afterwards was named after him, the Reinhard operation, named after that Heydrich Reinhard. 3 camps were built of extermination, unlike concentration camps or labor camps, where the weak and the old and the women and the children were sent to an immediate extermination, but women and men who could still physically fit to work were exploited for purposes of labor in terrible conditions. Here we're talking about 3 camps, extermination camps, and these camps were Belzec in the southern part, southeast of, in Galicia, to which the Jews were sent from Krakow and the area. And there was another camp around Lublin, where there was in a place called, Sobibor. You have to remember this name because it's going to actually reappear in my presentation. And another camp, a southern camp called the Treblinka camp, to which mostly the Jews of Warsaw were sent, Warsaw and the near vicinity. The description of those camps, very briefly, all those three camps were built according to one model. It was 400 to 600 square meters, all fenced up and concealed and camouflaged. They grouped together all the Jews from the ghettos. You know that even before that, they grouped the Jews together in ghettos in terrible living conditions, in crowdedness and diseases and hunger and the plague, and all those who were brought together were brought to the Umschlagplatz near the train station. All three concentration camps were built close to the railroad system within the area of forests that actually concealed them. The people who were brought in from the ghettos were uploaded to cattle cars, train cars. Within one car there was enough room for perhaps 40 or 50 people, but they were crammed into it, and there were no less than 100 and sometimes 140 to 150 people who were shoved into one car. If you take the Treblinka camp, which is our topic today, the distance between Warsaw and Treblinka, when you take the train, is a matter of a few hours, not too many. However, transporting those cattle cars that were full of people did not take hours, but rather days, for different reasons of transportation and providing or giving preference to other trains that were carrying, means of warfare. Very often this journey took 4 to 5 days without food, without water, terrible crowdedness and density. People went on the train with their belongings, and the testimonies that we heard were the ones that were tested and examined very meticulously by the defense attorneys. People, had no toilets or anything. They had to do what they did on the spot. They didn't get any water. Many of them were suffocated. And they died of starvation and dehydration. Sometimes the car would stand for a day or 2 days in one station, and those who managed to make it to the window at the top of the car that was barred with barbed wire yelled out and screamed to the people who convened in that train station to watch that sight. They would scream for a bit of water and would, throw, his watch or something, and sometimes they'd get the water, and other times we heard testimonies about the man who actually received the watch or any other piece of belonging would fill a glass of water and sort of hand it over to the window, but then spill it on the ground and not give it to the man. After such a journey, when the train car would arrive, the train cars arrived, they waited in Malkinia, which was a train station, just the one station before Treblinka, 4 kilometers away from Treblinka, and this train had dozens of such cars, and a few cars were detached from them and advanced to Treblinka, and the others had to wait in Malkinia. When the cars arrived at the Treblinka train station, the doors were opened, and there were terrible screaming and beating up and dogs and people screaming alle raus and verfluchten Juden raus, with terrible beating up of the guns. And all those who were still alive, emerged from the train cars, and obviously many dead remained behind, and excrements and urine remained on the floor of that car. And then forced labor, Jewish forced labor, from whom the witnesses in the trial came, and their role upon arrival was to remove the bodies from the cars, to clean them very thoroughly from all the filth that accumulated on them. Everyone was removed from the train. The weak and the old and the children were led to the right-hand side of the dock. There was this building called Lazaret. There was a hospital with a Red Cross, and all those who lagged behind and were led to Lazareth Hospital, and that was just a camouflage. It was a way to conceal what actually took place behind it. There was a huge pit, and there was an SS man sitting there, and he shot the heads of all those who entered, women, elderly people, children, and he would throw them into the pit where there was a permanent fire burning. The women and the men who remained there were not sent to Lazareth, and they had to part. Men had to go to the right and women to the left, or vice versa, I don't remember, and they were brought into two big shacks or barracks, and they were ordered to take off their clothing. The Jewish forced workers had to actually screen through their clothes to classify them according to different categories, to take all the precious belongings, to register them, to write them down, to tag every piece of every object, and all the men and all the women remained naked as the day they were born. And by the way, as far as the clothes and the valuables are concerned, there was a very accurate registration of all that was taken from them and sent to Germany. And perhaps I'll read a few lines. In the ruling, it says that at the beginning of March 1943, Blabochnik was in Lublin, and he was an Austrian friend of Himmler. He was in charge of this entire topic of the extermination camps. He gave a report to Himmler concerning the valuables and the money that was taken, and among other things, it says the following: March 43 is 6 months before the end of the Treblinka camp we're talking about, and also the other camps were still in operation. It wasn't yet the end of it all. And in this report, they enumerate $1,100,000 in notes, the rest in gold coins from 34 countries, notes from 34 countries, 2,910 kilograms of gold bars, 18,700 kilograms of silver bars, 16,000 karat in diamonds, and more. To conclude, the value of the objects taken from the Jews is estimated by 178,745,960.59 German marks. The people had to go through a process in which their hair was cut off. The naked women had to pass in front of 5 Jews who belonged to the 5 Jewish forced laborers who were supposed to shear off their hair, and they used those huge scissors and there were supervisors, inspectors of the SS to oversee their work. Their hair and the hair of men as well was sheared, was cleaned, was put into the right place and sent to the German Reich. And from the women's hair, they made the filling of gloves for the scuba divers teams and various other purposes that I will not go into now. Once the naked men and women were shaved, they were led to camp number 2 where the gas chambers were. The transition was done along a trail, a 2-meter trail that was hedged by barbed wire that were camouflaged by branches of trees, and these people were made to run up this trail that the Germans called Schlauch, pipe, and in sarcasm it was called Himmelstrasse, namely the path to the heavens, into the gas chambers. Initially there were only 3 gas chambers. Over time another 10 were added. By the way, in the winter, in the Polish European winter, one needn't make them run. They saw this building from afar, and the terrible cold weather made them run to find shelter from the terrible cold, and that shelter was the gas chambers. And they actually cried like an injured animal. But on days that weren't that cold, they had to be spurred with beatings and slappings. This conference talks about shame. In the opening of the gas chambers, there was a veil, a parochet, that had the verse from the Psalms. This is the gate to the Lord. Only righteous men will cross or come through it. And there was a Star of David that was embroidered on it. We're talking about shame. There was one more interesting thing there. The Jewish forced workers, as I will tell you later on what their role was, also had to use their lavatories, but they couldn't spend more than 2 or 3 minutes in those lavatories. And the Nazis in the SS camp appointed a Jew to oversee what they did there, lest they stay in those lavatories more than those 2 or 3 minutes that they were allowed to stay there. And the Nazi had made him dress up like a rabbi. They had him grow his beard. His name was Julian Shaya. And they hung on his chest a big clock, and he was in charge of those few minutes that were given to them when they had to use the lavatories, and they called him the Scheissmeister. I'm saying this here, not always do I tell people about this, but here, because the topic is shame, I think it is so very important to know that in addition to the extermination, there was also terrible humiliation. And infinite humiliation, like, for example, the deputy commander of the camp, whose name was Kurtz, I forget his last name, he walked around with a hound, with a Browning hound, and he would catch a Jew who was among the forced workers and just actually urge the dog to attack the groin of the man. And he had this image of a doe, and he would humiliate the Jews in such a way. So if we go back to the gas chambers and the way these people were made to run up the trail, they crammed some 400 people into one gas chamber. There was this very heavy lumber door, a wooden door that was lifted like the door of a garage, and the Ukrainians were there, and I'll soon explain more about them, and they sort of pushed the people, some 400 people, into the gas chamber. They lowered that heavy wooden door, and the person in charge of the gas with the diesel engine injected this monoxide into that gas chamber, and he left them there for 20 minutes, after which all the cries and the screaming came to an end. They would then lift that heavy wooden door, and what they found was one mess of people, dead people, embracing each other. They had to be severed from one another, and then the Jewish forced workers had to separate the bodies, to place everybody on a stretcher, take it to a huge pit at the very back of the camp to which all the bodies were thrown. But as they were running in that direction, there were still other forced workers whose name was dentist, and their role was to open the mouths of all the murdered people and pull out the gold fillings and crowns. A large quantity of gold was removed from the mouths of the murdered people, and only then did they throw them into the pit while spreading chlorine on them. At the very bottom of the pit, there were also forced workers whose role was to put them in an orderly fashion and to spray chlorine on them in order to allow for the next layer to be put on top of it. How long did it take them to get from the train station until those bodies were thrown into the pit? Well, we have testimony of the last commander of the camp who commanded the camp for quite a long time, maybe for 10 months, and he was brought to trial. And his name was Franz Stangl. He was brought to trial in Düsseldorf after the war.
This is what he says in his testimony. If I were to be asked how many people were killed using gas in one day, I think it is my evaluation that we could have really exterminated a whole trainload with every cart comprising 100 people. As I said before, sometimes there were 140 inside one. So again, 350,000 within 3 hours. If we had a 14-day shift, if we again worked for 14 days, we could exterminate about 12 to 13,000 people. There were many days in which we worked from morning till night, and it happened that sometimes we look by torchlight. About 14,000 people were exterminated in a day. So all in all, the Treblinka camp, notice, please, pay heed, was established because of the Van Zek Committee, January 1942. And already 2 months later, in March 1942, it started, the Berzitz camp started operating. And a month later, and with terrible efficiency, after 1 month, also in Sobibor, they started working, and then in Treblinka. That means that in April or May of 1942, approximately, a few months after the camp was established, this extermination camp, again, only with 3 gas chambers, but again, and I said with time they added additional chambers with time, but only in Treblinka about 875,000 Jews were exterminated. The camp was shut in August of 1943. There was a rebellion of the Jewish labor workers. They tried to run away. They tried to fight back, the SS staff. And they were, of course, killed. Some of them were able to run away, but the camp was shut down towards the end of 1943. And during its existence, close to 900,000 people, Jews, were exterminated in that camp. And similarly, Sobibor camp functioned, and the Belzec camp functioned in the same way as I mentioned before. Let's get back to the accused person on trial. As I said, in 1942, May of 1942, that Ukrainian young man, whose name was Ivan Demjanjuk, was taken captive by the German army. And again, the life of Russian soldiers in the hands of the Germans were not easy at all. They hardly got any food or shelter. They were abused, they were molested. And at that time, the Germans needed more manpower, more aids in the extermination camps. So that the main nucleus of manpower were about a group of 90 Germans. But these 90 Germans were graduates of the Euthanasia operation. As you know, they use an Asia operation, which is, again, merciful death, so to speak. And in the late 1930s, before the war, and even in 1940 and 1941, there was this operation in the German Reich to exterminate Germans, non-Jews, Germans, but again, mentally ill people, the retarded, using gas. And as I said, this was even before the outbreak of the war. Because, in order to purify the race, the species, and these people cost money, of course, and that is why it was decided by those who decided to exterminate them, and it was done using gas. In Berlin, in Turganstrasse, number 4, in a house, and that's why the Euthanasia operation was called T4, after that first letter of the Strasse, of the street number 4 in Berlin, where these people were murdered. And those teams in the extermination camps from the Reinhardt operation, that main nucleus of people were graduates of the euthanasia operation. They already knew how to kill people using gas. But if you divide 90 or 92 people by three camps, that is, it comes to about 30 people per each camp. That was hardly enough. They needed so much more. They needed more manpower. So they took from those captives, the Russian captives, Ukrainian captives, Lithuanian captives, and they called out in the camp that whoever volunteers to help, in the war effort and help in this operation of exterminating Jews, would receive it was called Hilfswege. It was basically, these were sort of aids, voluntary aids, or people who came to help, volunteer helpers. And there were a great number of captives, Russians mainly, but also Lithuanians, who volunteered to, come out of that captivity and leave those difficult conditions of captivity in order to come and serve the mechanism of Jewish extermination. And these Hilfswillige, as they were called, were recruited to the Travniki camp, not far from Lublin, where they underwent training and were given uniforms. Usually it was black uniforms. And some of them received weapons as well. And they helped that extermination mechanism. First of all, they were sent out to ghettos to hunt down people who were hiding and did not arrive at those collection points, the deportation points near the train stations. Some of them were employed in the extermination camps themselves. And today there is no doubt that also Ivan Demjanjuk, who was a captive, volunteered as well. He was in the Travniki camp. He worked there. And he helped in exterminating Jews. I think one of the crucial pieces of evidence was a certificate, because those who were in the Travniki camp received a certificate with a photograph, with a description, just like a soldier. Now let me just go back a little. How did this man come to be accused and put on trial in the state of Israel? After the war, this man found his way to the USA, and just like other Nazi criminals, he changed his name, called himself John and not Ivan. And upon entering the USA, he had to, proclaim and describe where he was during the war. He said he was a captive. And in fact, his story also, when he was on trial, he told the following story. He said that during the entire time of the war, he was in captivity constantly, and he moved around from one captive camp to another. And at the end of the day, he joined the Vlasov camp. And Vlasov was a general, a Russian general, who was taken captive with the entire armory. And he was a great fighter, that is true, and he again took a great part in the defense of Moscow. But at the end, he was anti-communist, and that is why he volunteered and he proposed to the Germans to create this whole division that would aid and assist the German army. So Demjanjuk, our man, claimed that finally he joined the Vlasov unit after he left his captivity. And then he told us that he arrived in the USA. And of course, this was all false. So as I said, Demjanjuk claimed that he was a captive, he was held captive, and he did not participate in any sort of operation of those Hilfswillige. However, inter alia, on the trial, that certificate, that soldier certificate, was presented from Travniki with his picture. So there was sort of a trial within a trial as to the authenticity of that certificate. The defense claimed that it was forged. And why? Because the KGB wants to revenge all those who joined the Vlasov general, and that is why they forged this particular picture. So the defense said. But it was proven beyond any doubt that the certificate was authentic because of the ink, the stamps, the paper, it all fit in. By the way, the certificate, how did we get the certificate? In the USA, it was used in trials against Demjanjuk, again for his right to immigrate to the USA. And the USA asked of the Soviet authorities, and they sent the USA the certificate which proved as proof that he served the Nazis. And it was written that he was in Sobibor and Treblinka, and this certificate was then given back to the Soviet Union by the American authorities. At the end of the day, it arrived here in Israel for the usage of our trial in a very indirect way. I'm not going to go into it, how it got to Israel. In any case, it was presented. It was completely authentic. And that is why it was quite clear that his alibi was false from beginning to end. Now, what evidence did we have in the trial? First of all, how did it all begin? And I'll just keep it brief. And how much time do I have? 20 minutes. So it started off as follows. In the USA, in the Ministry of Justice, there is a whole department of Nazi crimes, again, in order to be able to take away their citizenship and evacuate them. Now, this department asked for aid from the Israeli police to get witnesses who were survivors of camps who would be able to testify in the USA against those suspects. For this purpose, inter alia, there was this cardboard was sent with 17 passport photographs of suspects that were living in the USA and who were, suspects in helping the Nazis. So that the Israeli police force would be able to find witnesses, survivors of camps, who would be able to identify those photos. In case they would identify, they would be summoned to the USA to testify in the trials of those suspects. In our case, we are talking about, again, this sort of cardboard with 17 photographs of suspects. And every such photograph had a description as to the person in the photograph of what he was suspected. Photograph number 16 on this piece of cardboard was of Demjanjuk. And the last was Volorenko, who was also from Treblinka. That was photo 17. However, every photograph had an explanation as to the person and of what he was suspected. And photograph number 16, so Demjanjuk, it was written that he was suspected of serving the Nazis in the Sobibor, in the extermination camp Sobibor and not Treblinka. And why? Because in his Treblinka certificate, as I had explained before, that came from the right from the Soviet Union to the USA, it was written that he was placed in Sobibor. Our police officer here in Israel, Miriam Radrika, published in the media, in the press, a request to survivors of Treblinka, Sobibor, to come present themselves and to see if they can identify anyone in the photographs. 9 people came on different days, at different times, in different years, from different places, from the USA. 9 different people who came completely separately. She showed them all those photographs and she said, "Do you know any of these people?" And one after the other, again on separate days, they had no connection one to the other, on separate occasions, the survivors of Treblinka pointed at picture number 16 and said, "This is Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible." He got that nickname, Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, as the name of a terrible Tsar in Russia, because of the terrible deeds that he committed beyond the technical operation of the engines there. And then the officer said to each one separately, "You are wrong," because she had read that description that this person is not even from Treblinka. It was written that he's from Sobibor. But those people were adamant, and they said, "No, these were survivors who were part of the laborers in camp number 2. They worked in the gas chambers. They were those who took out those dead bodies from the gas chambers, and they had seen that person from 10 or 15 meters away on a daily basis." And, sometimes they were very moved, they were very excited when they gave their testimony. And although the officer said, "You're wrong," the people said, "No, you're wrong. I was there and I saw him." And of course, some said it with greater confidence, some with less so. I think some people identified him immediately. But again, there were those that with great passion and with a lot of emotions identified him as the man from Treblinka and not Sobibor. Because it was only later, during the trial, that it was discovered that it's true that, again, he was first was supposed to be sent to Sobibor, and there's also a testimony of his friend Grochenko that they sort of supposedly worked in Sobibor together. However, because those Hilfswilliger kept being transferred from one camp to the other, and wasn't all registered in that soldier certificate. And that is why the state of Israel again asked for him to again be handed over again on the basis of what he did in Treblinka and not Sobibor, because 6 of those 9 witnesses that came over to the police station to identify the photographs, again 3 of them, by the way, passed away in the meantime, but we have to remember that the identification of those photographs at the police station took place about 10 years or maybe 6 before the trial again, and there was a lapse in time between one identification and the other. It didn't all happen at once, and until the trial opened, 3 of them had passed away. However, the statement was submitted, all the affidavits were submitted during the identification process, which was used. 6 of them were live witnesses at the time of the trial. Not only did they identify him in the photographs, but again, when he was right in front of them, face to face, they identified him. And one of the witnesses who didn't want to come to Israel, a German SS officer from the euthanasia operation, Otto Horn, refused to come as a witness in the trial, but he was willing to testify in Berlin. And then our courts, we actually traveled with the defense and with the prosecution. We traveled to Berlin, and before interrogation judge, we sat together, and that Otto Horn came in order to identify the man. And Otto Horn was in Treblinka. He himself was put on trial later on. He was indicted. He said he did nothing. He was just a supervisor. He worked in the camp next to the gas chambers. By the way, talking about shame, I'm deviating for a moment from the chronology of my story, but I want to say that in 1942, towards the fall of 1942,
Himmler himself visited the camp and ordered to blur all the signs of the extermination. In other words, to actually pull out of the pits all the bodies that were there and burn them and grind them in order so there won't be any remainder of the mass murder that took place in this camp, because ostensibly he felt that the situation was changing and Germany was beginning to lose. Globocnik did not like this. He was in charge, the superior commander of the concentration camps. And if we're talking about shame, then Globocnik did not want to actually cover up those telltale signs. He said, no, quite the contrary. This is a source of pride for the German people. At the moment, I do not find the quote. Well, yes, I can find the quote, actually. Globocnik said he did not want to do as he was ordered, and he was asked why he wasn't burning the bodies. He said because the pits, the burial pits of Treblinka, should serve as a source of honor for the Germans. We have to actually put up bronze monuments because we had the courage to carry out the sacred job, to see this as a source of pride and not to cover up the trails and the tracks. And Himmler insisted that they do it, and they brought huge bulldozers and pulled out the bodies from the pits, and the upper layers were still in a state that could be dug out with a bulldozer, but the bottom layers were all rotten, and they sent forced laborers all the way down, and with their hands they pulled out the rotten flesh and put it in baskets and uploaded it to rails like railways, and they actually ground the bones to ashes, and they put it through sieves, and whatever remained they once again ground well so that not one bone of a human being would remain behind, and then they scattered it in the area. So I am nearing the end of the story based on these testimonies of the identification given to the police and to us in a very direct and unquestioned way. We found that indeed this defendant, Ivan Demjanjuk, was Ivan the Terrible. And this entire trial was an identification trial. Was he Ivan Golozny, Ivan the Terrible from Treblinka? And we found that yes, he was the man. It is true that he also served in Sobibor. However, even the court in Germany in 2011, which handed down its ruling about Sobibor, writes that for a short while he too was in Sobibor. In other words, not all the time, only part of the time. So the German court said that during the time he spent in Sobibor, he helped murder nearly 28,000 people. Now, just bear in mind that testimony given by Franz Stangl, who said that in the course of one day, 14,000 people could be murdered. So 28,000 is a job of 2 days, done at such a pace. But he was there perhaps for 2 or 3 months, and indeed he spent his time there too in Sobibor. But what we found was the identification testimonies that stated that without a shadow of a doubt this is the man, and he was convicted not just for his contribution to the operation of the gas machine, but there were terrible testimonies about the hideous deeds he did to the people who were walking to their death. There are testimonies, and I don't have time to read them to you, but atrocities that he conducted. When the transport arrived, he would take a sword or a pointed piece of iron, and he would poke through women. He would cut off their breasts. He had this hobby. And he would cut off the ears of the forced laborers and those who were taken to their death. He would, poke pregnant women, cut off their breasts, and tear them to pieces. There was this testimony that he once took a man, had him lie on his abdomen, and he took a drill and actually drilled into his behind. And he said, "Be strong. If you yell, I'll kill you." And that was, when he actually drilled into his anus. And a 12-year-old girl came out alive from the gas chambers. She had actually climbed over the heads of the people, and apparently the gas was heavier and there was less gas in the upper layer of the gas chamber. She came out of the gas chamber alive, naked. And I wouldn't want to say exactly how he abused and tortured that girl, but he did terrible atrocities that he definitely did not have to do because of any order that was issued. And this is why he was convicted and unanimously, according to the law of bringing Nazi criminals to justice, and the law is still in place. A death sentence is a part of the law. This death sentence was cancelled for every other offense but the Nazi crimes, and he was sentenced to death. As Eichmann was sentenced to death at the time, and obviously when it comes to such a verdict, there is an automatic appeal, and it was submitted on his behalf. It was heard. Our ruling was handed down in May 1987, I believe, but the appeal was only heard in 1990, I believe. A few years passed by because a few things happened in the middle. For example, the main defense attorney, Yoram Sheftel, somebody spilled acid on him and hit his eye, and that brought another delay. Another defense attorney, a former Justice Tzvi Tal, passed away while the trial was going on. So a few reasons for delay, and the defense itself was asking for recurrent delays. Hence, the appeal only opened much, much later, and in the meantime, something happened. The Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union cracked in 1989. That was the beginning of the perestroika and the glasnost, and archives in the Soviet Union were opened, and the prosecution actually dug into those archives in the Soviet Union, and what was discovered was different documents that were brought because of the decency of the prosecution. It gave it to the disposal of the defense attorneys, and they used certain facts to contradict our claim that this was the man who actually operated the engine in Treblinka. And what did these documents contain? I'll say this very briefly. These were papers of testimonies that were collected by the government of the Soviet Union from various Wachmans that served the Nazis during the extermination. Those statements were given, of course, by people about themselves, but they also mentioned the names of other Wachmans that they were asked about. And inter alia, in some of those documents, it said two things. First of all, the name, a woman. This woman said that the person who operated the engine in Treblinka, her name was Dudek, and she said that he told her that he's the operator of the gas chambers and that his name is Marchenko, not at all Demjanjuk. Another type of documents was such that described the operator of the diesel engine of the gas chambers as a person with a long face, with black hair, whilst Demjanjuk had a round face, like football, and his hair was not at all black, but rather brunette or light blonde. And so the court received all those documents, and among other things, it found that they at least raise a reasonable doubt to the identification of the operator of this engine. Hence, he was acquitted because of doubt. Ultimately, he was extradited to Germany, and there he stood trial for Sobibor, not for Treblinka. And as we said, he was convicted for assisting the murder of nearly 29,000 people and was sentenced to 9 to 5 years of imprisonment. When I am asked what I think about the acquittal, then the Supreme Court Justice Dalia Dorner, my colleague, and myself are certain to this very day, without a shadow of a doubt, as to the identity of the man, Demjanjuk. And we know him to be Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible from the Treblinka camp. Marchenko, the Supreme Court itself mentions the fact that when Ivan Demjanjuk arrived in the U.S., among other things, he declared that his mother's maiden name was Marchenko, Olga Marchenko. And it was well known that in the Ukraine, very often, a man is called by the maiden name of his mom. And it can very well be that with respect to that woman that he used to visit, Ms. Dudek, he used to present himself as Marchenko. Perhaps he did not want to reveal to her his real name. So that's one thing, and that only strengthens the identification. And the fact that they said that the operator of the engine had long face with black hair, we do not know what is the source of this information. These are silent documents. They are pieces of papers. We do not know where the information came or what the motivation was of the person who disclosed this information. But let's assume that they are correctly stating that the operator of that engine was not rounded in the face and blonde, but rather long and black. So first of all, there are testimonies, explicit testimonies of the survivors who testified before us that the engine was actually operated by three. One was Ivan Groznik, his friend Nikolai, and the third is Schmidt. And I do not know if he was a Ukrainian or a German. He might have been a German guy. In other words, it was not the only one who operated the engine. Perhaps that description that they gave about a different man does not necessarily relate to him, but rather to Nikolai or Schmidt. In any case, let's set aside for a second Demjanjuk, and let's assume it's not Demjanjuk. Testimonies of eyewitnesses who saw the man on a daily basis from 10 meters away. Otto Horn, an SS man who has no motivation whatsoever to convict. A colleague, a Ukrainian friend, Tzvi, testified to us. He identified his picture twice before the U.S. government and the consulate in Germany, even before we conducted that trial in 1980. How is it possible that that man, Otto Horn, and the witnesses say that the man in the picture is very much like him? Maybe it's not the man, but he's very much like him, with round face and a blonde hair. And let's assume that those silent documents from the Soviet Union speak the truth. How can this contradiction be reconciled? Perhaps we're talking about different times, because when Demjanjuk worked in Sobibor, the engine in Treblinka never, came to rest. Perhaps he was talking about Nikolai or Schmidt. There was no downtime when it came to the engine in Treblinka, so there's no shadow of a doubt concerning the identity of that man. Marchenko and Demjanjuk are one and the same person. And this is the greatness of law, of the law system in the State of Israel, that whenever there's a doubt in the hearts of the justices of the Supreme Court sitting on the appeal, even in such a highly charged case, they did justice by the fact that they allowed that man to enjoy the benefit of the doubt. In any case, and I will end here, the man himself, and there were thousands and thousands like him, is not really interesting. What is interesting is that window that was opened through his trial to facts that would not have seen the light without that trial and would not have been made so clear, serving as clear-cut evidence. Concerning the shame, we already said that at the time, those who actually did the terrible work did not consider it shameful, but rather a source of pride. They humiliated as much as possible, using terrible means, and I haven't told you about it all. There were so many forms of humiliation. They humiliated the people who were taken to their death and the Jewish forced laborers. And here I would like to end. If there are any questions, and if there is any time for questions, there's no time for questions. So thank you very much for your